Demertzi. Oh, yeah, we are recording the meeting. We will stop the recording at the end of the talk when you are asking questions and when we have a discussion. So Athena heads the Physiology of Cognition lab at the University of Belgium in Liège, where she investigates the neural basis of consciousness in health and disease. She has conducted a wide range of behavioral and neuroimaging studies of consciousness in various clinical populations and states, and is also very interested in the ethical and social implications of this research. Today, she will tell us about something clinically very important, namely the proxies of consciousness in the absence of reportability. And Athena told me that she's happy to take questions during the talk, so feel free to just raise your hand to ask anything. Thank you. Athena, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nadine. Will you keep track of the questions? Because while I present, I may not see people.
Yeah, that's okay. I will do that.
Fantastic. So thank you so much for the kind invitation to be here with you. So yeah, the topic that I chose today is about proxies of consciousness in the absence of reportability. I think this conveys a bit my story in the field of consciousness research, which comes heavily from the clinical paradigm. So I have been doing a lot of research with patients with disorders of consciousness. And from my work with this clinical population, I realized we can have very good insights about how typical consciousness works. So here I would like to share with you what kind of metrics, proxies, as I say, we have come up with in the latest years. And in the end, maybe we can put this together and raise a common discussion about what this might mean for typical consciousness. So let me put you a bit in the context of the work we do, or I used to do at least. My PhD, my postdoc was based on this work with brain damaged people. And these are individuals who have sustained severe brain injuries and that they have been treated in the intensive care unit, and afterwards they find themselves in different state of consciousness if they're not recovered their consciousness. So we're talking about the vegetative state or unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, the minimally conscious state mainly. And these are entities that they come after some time in coma. Coma doesn't last long. It's a very transitory period, like approximately 2 weeks, that people lie with eyes closed and they don't respond to any external stimulation. So that's why they're considered unconscious. So cognition and consciousness in that sense has to be inferred from behavior. So in that case, cognitive capacity is based on motor responsiveness. Like I said, people in coma, they are not considered conscious because they don't respond to even very painful stimulation, that they will not open up their eyes. Once arousal is restored and there is eye opening, but communication is still not established, patients are said to be in a vegetative state. And if they show some type of awareness, and when I say type of awareness, I'm referring to simple responses to commands like move your thumb, or people show non-reflex movements like they follow their image in a mirror, they are said to be in a minimally conscious state. And only once we have a bridge of communication, a communication code with them, that is interactive and functional and accurate, then they're said to have exited a disorder of consciousness, and then the efforts are onto a rehabilitation in order to achieve a good recovery. So you can see that from this situation that we have very big issues with this clinical population, and that was my internal motivation actually to do research, because consciousness seems to carry a moral significance. So there is an ethical imperative when we deal with consciousness, and we see that in the clinics very, very vividly. So if you work with this kind of population, you will have families coming to you asking like, is my patient understand anything, or do these patients do my beloved one feel pain, or what to do afterwards. Um, we also ask the opinions of health care workers and also scientists as to how they feel towards these clinical entities. So we went in the past years in conferences and meetings, and we were asking very broad questions to the public, like, do you find it acceptable to stop treatment, that is nutrition and hydration, when it comes to the vegetative state or minimally conscious state? And we also asked this question, but a bit more personally, like, would you like to be kept alive? If you imagine that you were in this situation, you can even do that yourselves at the moment. You can try to answer this question just to be to have the first-hand experience. So we found that there is a mediation of between the attitudes, the mediation of, let's say, the consciousness level to the attitudes that people express. Meaning that if you think that people are in a vegetative state, which equals to less conscious than minimally conscious, people find it more acceptable to stop treatment. But interestingly, if you think that you're in such a severely compromised condition yourself, consciousness really doesn't matter, because it seems that people would not like to be kept alive if they imagine themselves in either condition. So there is such a thing that, like, what we broadly think about society and what we feel about our own medical treatment. When it comes to the ethics of how to behave with these patients, the pain is another factor that can help us understand how people feel about these conditions. So pain is not to be confused with nociception. Nociception is the physical stimulation of the body. Pain is like the subjective experience of this stimulation as uncomfortable, and yeah, we all know what pain is, right? And this is also to be differentiated with suffering. So when we put pain into in the mix, let's say it's like, and equate pain with a conscious experience, we found that there was a mediation also in the attitudes. Like when people first, we found the same effect, that people were feeling less comfortable to treatment withdrawal in minimally conscious state than the unresponsive. But even in the unresponsive, when people thought that they were not experiencing pain, they were more comfortable with treatment withdrawal. So it seems like pain equates with some type of consciousness, and that like that we're less willing to take decisions for end of life. We have to keep in mind, though, that when there is such a restrictive condition, like when you cannot communicate your mind or your wishes, it seems that time, if you spend more time in such a state, we tend to calibrate our lives. And of course, with the source of consciousness, we don't have the chance to communicate with people, but we can do so with people in the locked-in syndrome. So locked-in syndrome is not a disorder of consciousness because people can communicate clearly, but they are very close to the to the clinical picture, because they are paraplegic, sometimes aphonic. They have been through severe brain injury, and so we can ask their opinions about how they experience their lives after the accident and being in a locked-in syndrome. So these are studies that we have done in collaboration with the Association of the Locked-in Syndrome in Paris, in France. Many of you might know it. Maybe you know the film, the Scaphandre les Papillons, the how's it in English? The diving bell, the butterfly. So this movie is based on a book written by Jean-Dominique Bauby, who ended up being locked in syndrome. And after his death, the Association du Loctin Syndrome was created. So we had access to these patients and we asked them different questions concerning their quality of life, the continuity of self-image before and after the accident, and how they experience selfhood. What we found is that, first of all, people, like in the majority, as we can see here, they professed a satisfactory quality of life. So this is a self-calibrated scale from, let's say, 0 to +5, professing a good quality of life, and up to -5, a bad quality of life. And the majority said that at the moment, I feel that I'm leading my life as I want to. And only a minority reported a low score. And this had to do mainly with how people had access to their community, whether they had access to a communication code, and the time that they spent in the locked-in syndrome. And this makes sense. I mean, this is the so-called disability paradox. This is how you and me would think that our lives and ourselves would have changed if we imagine themselves in the condition. So look at here, this study, where the majority of people said that if I imagined that I were in a locked-in syndrome, this is healthy people, we see that there a few of them just said, I would think that I would be the same person. My life would have completely changed. But patients with locked-in syndrome think the opposite, like they profess a continuous self-image. The issue with the locked-in syndrome, though, is like it seems that the way that they are experienced as people, as persons, has to do with interpersonal attitudes. Meaning that many people who say that I cannot communicate with my environment, people treat me like object, and they don't take my wishes to consideration. They treat me like a child. And these, they said, really affect how they feel as people. So we can see that there is such a thing as an ethical and moral significance when it comes to these, to study consciousness from the clinical perspective. And now it's like how we can find the best ways to profess consciousness or not evidence consciousness in this population. So the first thing we target, as I said, is behavior. At the bedside, we have some tools, and the most popular tool is the coma recovery scale. As you see, it evaluates different functions like auditory, visual, motor, or motor verbal communication scale, and we have information about the type of arousal. Point is, we cannot really always trust the behavior of these of patients. And this comes from two sources of information, a piece of evidence. Like first, it was like really like the use of standardized assessment made an impact. So when we followed approximately 100 patients that they came to the university hospital here, 45 of them had the clinical diagnosis of vegetative state, right? But this was given by the physician without, it was just with a qualitative criteria. And when we checked them with the coma recovery scale, 18 of them, only 18 of them, they were actually in a minimally conscious state. So 40% were carrying an erroneous diagnosis, and that was, if you can understand the consequences of such a finding. At the same time, when we use functional neuroimaging with PET scan here, we during the years we ended up recognizing different patterns of brain activity between the MCS and BS. So here, for example, you can see the brain, a typical pattern of metabolic activity of an unresponsive patient. So in blue, you see areas that they are hypometabolic. So neurons do not really use the glucose that we provide. Whereas in this case, this is a typical profile of, I'm sorry, this is the unresponsive state, and this would be the minimally conscious state, where glucose metabolism would be more widespread. So if we contrast like the findings we find with the coma recovery scale, people that they would be coined as unresponsive showed a pattern, brain pattern that is not typical of the situation, and they were actually in a minimally conscious state. So this is what I mean by proxies, how we can come closer to the truth of what is unresponsive, what is minimally conscious, what is normal consciousness. So my challenge came during my PhD, where we had to find easy ways, cheap ways, and precise ways to find proxies of retained cognitive ability. So when I say cognitive or conscious, I mean, sometimes I use them interchangeably. I know that there are really nuances there, but please take it with a pinch of salt. We can discuss later of what more details are. So the easiest thing that we can use when it comes to the evaluation of patients is to study their brain activity during resting state. And that solves a very big challenge in the clinics, because in many cases we don't have the chance to have sophisticated experimental setups. PET scan is very expensive, and of course EEG is the simplest, but we all know how the spatial resolution, how shallow it is. But we have the chance that patients, they get into the MRI for the actual, for the routine examination. So we ask the radiologist, please press the button, the record button for 10 minutes, and let's acquire some resting state fMRI data. And now what it means, actually, it's like the bet that we have, like how we make sense of that. So our brains during rest, most of you might know that it's not idle. Actually, we're very active. We can see how our minds, ongoing mind can entertain different types of thoughts, associations, forms. It's very, very rich. And of course, William James was, again, one of the first to describe it as the stream of thought, the stream of consciousness. So if we think about it, it's like the brain is using, it's almost less than 2% of the body's weight, and it hosts less than 5% of the fog changes, right? Which means that 80% of its energy is spent for neuronal signaling. So this means that while conscious awareness, what we mean like by evoked cognitive explicit activity, is energetically inexpensive, it is dependent upon a very complex, dynamically organized state of the brain that is achieved at great expense. So resting state, our brains during such a condition really comes at great expense. What does this mean? During the years, like we understood that even when we don't do anything, our brains work by default. And this came out of a realization that once we are performing a task, actually there are certain brain regions that they show systematic deactivations, even during task performance. And these are now the first network of regions. It's the very famous default mode network. We can see here how the time courses of different parts of the brain, like the midline, precuneus, anterior cingulate, prefrontal cortices, how across time they show coordinated activity, and that's how they're said to be functionally connected. So this is also called functional connectivity. However, the brain, apart from showing functional connections, is show also anticorrelations. Here again is the default mode network. We can see it in yellow and orange, that they show coordinated activity, but at the same time, there are other regions that they go in the opposite direction. Like when the activity of one is up, the other one is down. And so these anti-correlated activity, it was estimated to happen on average every 20 seconds when measured with fMRI. And we think that actually there is a cognitive counterpart of this functionality. So we think that across the years that the default mode network would reflect the so-called internal awareness, things that they are self or generated, self-related, like projecting our thoughts and ourselves in the future, in the past, whereas everything else that is environmentally oriented, it's about external awareness, and that would be the mainly the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, like the external control network, the frontoparietal, supported by the frontoparietal areas. I don't want to go into details about the experiment we did, but this we really coined when people were saying I'm mostly oriented toward my thoughts, the default mode network was activated. And when I said I was paying attention to my environment, then the external control network was activated. And recently we have hypothesized that these anti-correlated activity is important for consciousness, and I will show you why now, and later we can discuss the mechanism behind it. But indeed, if we see that how the anti-correlations behave across the different states of awareness, of consciousness, we can see how their functional connectivity is also changing. For example, if we use hypnosis, and when I say hypnosis, it's like the way that is used in the anesthesia department. So the anesthesiologists here, they use it to perform surgery, and we ask them to help us with our studies as well. So what we did, we checked the integrity of the default mode network and the anticorrelations across different states, like with some people in the normal wakefulness, during autobiographical mental imagery. That is mainly, it was primarily happy memories, like holidays, and during the same under hypnotic induction. So we see first that how hypnosis reached high levels of absorption, dissociation, and had less thoughts about the environment. So this means that we achieved a satisfactory state. And although the default mode network really did not change in integrity, it was actually the anticorrelations that were showing dramatic modifications, meaning that they got almost absent during a hypnotic state compared to the other two conditions. We checked also the anticorrelations under anesthesia. We found a similar patterns. Here we see the DMN and the anticorrelated areas during wakefulness, and how under propofol unconsciousness, we see that the DMN primarily is quite resistant, especially the posterior regions, but the anticorrelations also reduce. And the anticorrelations seem also to be absent in disorders of consciousness. So here we can see the integrity of the DMN from healthy people, and those that they exited the minimally conscious state that they're considered conscious, and that they persist in disorders of consciousness. Here, though, the anticorrelations that they look very, very nicely in conscious people, they not only disappear, but they become even go in the opposite direction in disorders of consciousness. And what we see is that when we check the neuronal counterpart, like of the anticorrelations, we see that if we correlate them with PET glucose uptake, the anticorrelations seem to have high metabolic values, whereas they become have neuronal activity when it comes to patients with disorders of consciousness. Would there be any questions so far, or shall I continue with more proxies, like with more? Okay. So apart from these anticorrelated antagonistic system behavior, we have more networks during resting state. So this would organize in large-scale networks, as I said, the executive control network, the SALIS network, that is.
Sorry, Athena, there is a question. Sorry, yeah. Somebody asks in the chat, what is meant by positive and negative connections in the previous graph? So I think that's a clarification question.
Yeah. So here?
Yeah, but yeah, positive and negative connections.
Positive and negative connections, like we're talking about this graph, right?
I guess so. Maybe the question asker can say something. Um,
Uh, yes, the thing is, I'm at a Starbucks, so I hope the background noise isn't too overwhelming. But yes, I was just curious if you can quickly explain what fMRI positive connectivity and negative connectivity mean. Also, because if the x-axis is the same quantity as this PET glucose uptake, then the two graphs will both be showing, as I understand them, a positive association, right? Because if in one case it's the negative connectivity, then if you took the yeah, basically, if you could kindly explain a little bit more about these two graphs.
Perfect. So when I say DMN correlations, the positive connectivity is how these are correlation values between seeds that they represent the default mode network, let's say the posterior singular cortex, and checking how these represent how these are, let's say, the amount of the connectivity that they are shown in different populations, from healthy people to minimally conscious and unresponsive. So here, if we check how the DMN correlations, we see positive connectivity here, correlates with PET glucose. In we see here in blue the control people. So we see that there is a trend with that in healthy situations, the DMN looks more neuronally, let's say, active as we go toward patients with disorders of consciousness. And this is the opposite. It goes in the same direction, but there is a negative regression line because we're talking about negative connectivity. So now the anticorrelations that they come with negative values, they are more preserved neuronally in healthy situations and less in disorders of consciousness. Would that be
So would I understand correctly that the y-axis in the two graphs below represents the same quantity, even though you're sort of labeling it differently to highlight the
no,
difference?
no, that would be the areas of the default mode network, and these would be the areas of that they show anti-correlated activity to the DMN. That would be, let's say, frontoparietal regions mainly.
I guess I should read your papers to understand better. Thanks.
So if we continue with more networks, we can see that there are more networks in the brain that they organize during rest spontaneously. And we were thinking, like, if we were to use this kind of model when it comes to patients, which network would make the difference into differentiating different different clinical groups? So that is a study we did some years ago where we used sensory related and large scale networks, and we tried to see which one predicted the class between minimally conscious and unresponsive state. So we found, first of all, that there was this network that is surprisingly for us, it was not the DMN that we were thinking that would make the difference. It's actually a network that comprises of auditory and visual areas like temporal and occipital lobes. And this pattern of connectivity was more preserved in the minimally conscious state than unresponsive. So when we used this pattern to see how new patients that we have never seen here, we never evaluated, how they would be classified as unresponsive or minimally conscious state. So we used a support vector machine classifier. We gave these three features. And here it would be the decision plane. So everybody would be on that side. They would be classified as responsive here, minimally conscious. And we had colleagues from international colleagues from Cornell and Salzburg. They shared very generously their data with us. And what we found is, like, we had 22 new patients, and out of them, only two we had an erroneous classification, meaning that what the pattern said and what the doctor said was not matching. So it seems that there is a kind of importance the way that these cross-modal interactions work. to support the conscious level.
Can I ask you something about this?
Yes.
So this seems very interesting to me. I just wanted to check if I understood the methods well. So did you basically try this with all different networks, and then this was the only network that could classify above chance, or how did you?
So we tried
arrive here?
6 networks with the DMN, the frontoparietal, the salience, and the auditory, the visual, and the motor network, sorry, motor. And we had the cerebellum as a control network. So first we saw how each of them they would separate single patients, and all of them they did very good classification. It's just that this one it did the best. It was, I think, 43 out of 45 patients. But methods wise, by that time, if we stopped it, there would be double dipping, because we were predicting the class of patients from patterns that they were estimated in the same cohort.
Yeah. Okay,
That's why we asked to have an out of sample generalization with unseen data.
And that only worked for this network, or?
We checked it only for this because we were trying to answer a clinical question mostly than a neuroscientific question. We also tried a combination of networks, actually, whether they could do a better classification, but accuracy was not achieved higher than the single one. So by that time, I'm pretty sure if I had to do it now, everything would be more advanced, like more, they would, yeah, but we all know that if we were to do the study now, we would have done it differently. Point is that by that time, we're really happy to answer this clinical question, but at the same time, to me, it was like, if you see the pattern that was predicting the class, it has this to do with these cross-modal interactions, the talk between visual and auditory areas. Even during rest, it seems that this pattern is more prominent and preserved in minimally conscious state. We also tried, as the classification was going on, we also had the chance to check it with different conditions, and that was very nice case of patients with hemispherotomies. So these are children that they suffer from epilepsy, that they could not be treated with drugs, they were resistant. That's why they had to have their 2 hemispheres isolated, and this was a complete hemispherotomy. The neurosurgeon from the Necker Hospital in Paris really isolated the right brain, that was the epileptic, including the thalamus. And here we can see the interhemispheric connectivity, how it looks like in healthy matched controls for the 2 patients. So there is a nice connectivity transfer. And we have here the 2 patients, MA and JJ, that their interhemispheric talk is really, really low. And when it comes to networks, we can see here for patient 1 and patient 2, how now if we see it on the side, like the DMN, for example, would be preserved only on the one side or only on the right, meaning that the connectivity would not, if we were to check seeds on the right side, they would not predict connectivity on the contralateral. So this means that, yeah, I mean, the surgery did a very good job in that, and we could capture with fMRI. And when we checked the classification of, because we had also in mind, like how the isolated brain especially, can we say that it shows or still shows some preserved capacities for consciousness or cognition or anything that is close to that? So we checked the classifier, and at that time it was only 1 patient, because this patient was more mature to be compared with the age of the minimally conscious vegetative state. And we found that here the right isolated hemisphere, this hemisphere was closer to the class of the unresponsive patients, although it did not pass the decision plane to be completely classified as a vegetative, but the preserved left hemisphere was most among the brains of the minimally conscious state. So these cross-modal interactions between the occipital temporal cluster seems to be lower in the isolated brain tissue. The latest work we have done trying to find ways that to get closer to how the brain works in of these patients comes from brain dynamics. And what I mean by here is that if we check the whole connectome, so every line and every row here would be a region, and that would be the correlation matrix of how these areas correlate to each other across time. We see that during typical wakefulness, there is a dynamism in the way that areas connect to each other. They correlate positively, negatively, the short range, long range, and it seems that this kind of richness is very important for task performance, emotion, and cognition, which is a difference of what we find in unconscious states during sleep and anesthesia, both humans and animals, where these spatiotemporal organization is more rigid and the dynamics are less metastable. And it was hypothesized that when the brain is in this kind of organization, it cannot map the complexity of the internal and the external world. So if we equate that to unconsciousness, I will not go that far, but it seems to go to this direction.
Can I ask something? Or yeah, it's maybe more of a discussion point, but I'm curious what you think. This reminds me of the opposite of what you see happening with psychedelics.
Mm-hmm.
So when people take psychedelics, it seems like it's like the opposite of being rigid, the networks. Do you have any thoughts on that? How that's related?
Now the thoughts I'm making is like whether you think that people under psychedelics they are less conscious or more conscious. You somehow make this a question, or
yeah, just whether you think that whether that's related to the things you see here. I don't know if I can say this, but I think some people might say that they are more conscious. People on the psychedelics, they have more intense conscious experiences.
First of all, I have not taken drugs, kind of drugs, so I cannot talk by experience. But I know the literature about it. It's like the brain is more free to organize in a more fluid manner with accompanied phenomenological interpretations of how this might be experienced, like the echo dissolution. I heard about this. Maybe it's time that I do some drugs.
Maybe
By science to the drugs because peer pressure did not work. So whether, yeah, I mean, now I'm thinking also about other theories of consciousness that they predict, like even in order to be reportably able to say something about our mental state at the moment, to be stable about it, we need to have a cost benefit of how the brain is flexible in terms of small worldness and metastability. Like it has to be flexible in how to support some patterns for some time and then dissolve them later on. And to me, like during psychedelics, this pattern change is not that does not happen that often. It's more like the brain is more fluid. But I would not go into more discussion of this literature because I'm not that very well informed. But yeah. So your question has to do about mostly how phenomenologic is interpreted, this kind of organization, or
yeah, I guess so, because I was just it was just a thing that I noticed, that it seems kind of like the opposite of what you see in these psychedelic studies, that like instead of getting more freedom between networks, you get less freedom between networks. So that was just something I noticed, but
yeah.
that's very free. Thanks, that's okay.
we're analyzing some data at the moment when it comes to the dynamics during CEPER. If you're here, you can fill me in. It is ayahuasca and CEPER is not here, I guess, who's analyzing data set. But we're checking exactly that, how interstate dynamism looks like under these conditions. Very, very curious to see what happens indeed. I will fill you in. So when we check this interstate dynamics in disorders of consciousness, first we found that there is different ways that the brain self-organizes across time. And we found that there are mainly 4 patterns that they recurrently appear in the acquisition across 10-minute acquisition. So this very complex pattern, we can see here how the regions of interest we use are organized in terms of networks, and the how phase coherence is changing, is variable among regions. At the short term, long term, we see how rich this pattern is, in stark contrast with this kind of brain organization, where areas would show low phase coherence, so they will not talk to each other as much as this complex pattern. And then there are 2 types of, we thought they were intermediate patterns, one driven highly by the anticorrelations with the occipital and occipital regions, and the other one that shows an all-to-all overall positive coherence across regions. So everything talks to everything. And then we calculated how often each pattern would appear in different states. So here we see healthy situations, healthy people, minimally conscious and responsive, how this pattern 1 would be more frequent in these healthy conditions, and how the very simple brain organization would be more evident in unresponsive states. So the other 2 were not preferentially appearing more often in any groups. That's why we thought they were transitional. Interestingly, when we check the appearance of these patterns under propofol anesthesia, now even pattern 1 would be equally probable to appear across all conditions for those patients that they are exited in minimally conscious state. And now pattern 4 would be, so the very simple one would be the more prominent, independently of clinical diagnosis, which means that even healthy people would be in that case. The real dynamics, though, were calculated in the transitions between the different states. So here in black arrow, we see the trend to transition from the trend from going from healthy people, minimally conscious and unresponsive. So this ranking, and it means that it seems that the more conscious, let's say, you are, the more chances you have to re-enter the complex pattern and leave it for other to travel and explore other patterns as well, but this would be your main preference. Whereas in the gray, it shows the opposite trend. Like the less conscious you are, you have more chances to enter and show the very simple pattern 4 and leave it only for less complex patterns as well. That would be your preference if you were less conscious. So before going to the next topic, are there other questions that may have arisen? How do you say it?
Arisen, probably.
Arisen, thank you.
So I have a question if there's nobody else. Let me see if somebody else is asking.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, there's a question by Matan. Matan, do you want to?
Nice to meet you, Matan.
Hey, nice to meet you too. That's really brilliant. I'm just this idea of this Markov process of transitioning between connectivity states is really cool, and I'm wondering, have you actually tested whether there's evidence that this is a valid model as opposed to just there are no transitions, so healthy people are just in pattern 1, and unconscious people are in pattern 4. And these transitions that you see are what happens when you try to model it as if there was within the idea that there will be transitions, but actually when you compare it to a model that does not allow transitions, this model maybe wins.
So the model we used, it was from a statistical model that checked that. I'm trying to remember which test we used. It was not parametric test going from I cannot remember now. I'm so sorry, but going from healthy to minimally conscious and unconscious people. So it was a rank test mostly, but when you say model, you mean as prediction, like single class prediction, or what kind of model?
Sorry, I didn't mean to push you in any technical detail. What I meant more was more conceptually. It's cool to think about the brain as transitioning between different connectivity patterns, but I'm just wondering whether also actually given the fact that the strongest lines here are ones from one state to the same state, whether maybe maybe it's more appropriate to just say maybe this is not a valid model for some of these conditions. Maybe just a model that assumes that a connectivity pattern is stable is actually a better model.
I see. No, at that point, no, we did not do that. We did not check different assumptions. Like, we checked it against the null hypothesis that we don't have evidence for this thing. That's the only thing we did. But if we go like more model based, like, yeah, that could we can ask different questions depending on what we're interested each time. For me, it was also interesting that this kind of very complex patterns would appear in some patients, or these very simple pattern would appear also in healthy people. So it seems that we show this organization, but we enter it, we entertain it, but we don't spend. We're not locked in it. If we're healthy, let's say. So this dynamism seems to have some significance when it comes to support typical consciousness.
So maybe I can ask like a short follow-up question that's maybe more conceptual then. If there is evidence that healthy people go into these low connectivity phases, do you think what happens there is that there is actually a transient dip in consciousness level? Or is this like part of what it means to be conscious, or just a different state of consciousness?
So in that paper, we predicted, or we hypothesized that such a state, for example, would appear in situations when you're awake and aware, let's say when you were born mind blanking, like moments that you don't think of anything in particular. Now we checked it in more detailed manner with experience sampling, and it seems that actually mind blanking supported mostly about this state.
Right.
So this is really preliminary data, and it's not published yet, but physiologically it seems that these patterns say something that can be translatable also cognitively, but we are really deciphering what this might mean. So also, if we put it together with Thomas Trillon, a recent paper of EEG and mind blanking, that he is supporting the local sleep hypothesis, it can be that during typical wakefulness, yes, we are aware that we are conscious, but not all the time. It seems that maybe our brains needs a small break, kind of to recalibrate and continue, but we have the impression of discontinuity, as it's, I guess, happens very low time scales. I think for homeostatic reasons or for other reasons that we are trying to understand at the moment better. But
That's really cool and sounds very exciting.
it feels that it's very, very expensive for the brain to be on all the time. You need some off periods to steam off, I guess, if we take it like very, very broadly.
Thanks. There's another question. Sukrit? Sorry, I always forget how to pronounce your name.
Which are it? No, it's just a simple clarification question actually. On the next slide, the dynamics, is that combined across all participants, or is that only under propofol anesthesia, or is this it wasn't clear to me.
These dynamics are the dynamic transitions are estimated on this data set. It's not it's not on anesthetized people. There are people that
Okay.
can't awake, but in different clinical conditions.
Okay, and but you haven't differentiated the healthy participants from the minimally conscious participants in this figure.
Yes, in the paper we did, and
Okay.
I mean, but not at the single subject level, it was group level.
No, group level, that's fine.
Yeah.
So this is which one? This is the.
It was mainly these two, the transition between pattern 3 and pattern 4 that was more fluid for the minimally conscious than unresponsive.
Okay, I see. So that's the difference between the two groups. Okay.
Yeah, that paper was the narrative was different in terms that we did not try to answer like a clinical question. It was mostly like taking the disorders of consciousness as an how you say, sorry for that, as a toy example of how transitions would happen. And I'm verifying just now. So here would be, can you see the slide?
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, so exactly, that would be, yeah, just want to give you more precise information. And here the minimally conscious state would be in blue. So the transitions for the minimally conscious state, the transitions between the states, I was wrong before, it would happen more fluidly among these three patterns, but unresponsive would be mainly re-entering the pattern 4.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
I don't think I noticed the red and blue map onto the participants.
I cannot hear you. I'm sorry.
I was confused because I didn't figure out the fact that the red and blue map onto the two different groups. Is that right? Yeah.
I cannot hear you very clearly.
Anyways, no, it's fine. I think I was just confused about the figures because
so if we were
I didn't know that there were two groups. The red and blue lines are the two different groups, and you have not shown the green one. Is that right?
It's very, very difficult to understand.
Okay, that's fine. No problem.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. I'll read the paper.
I think it seems like it's clear now. I think so. Nick Shea also has a question. Nick,
this is all really cool. I wonder if you could go back to the cross correlation slide. I think it's one slide away from this.
Yeah.
The one with the yeah. So what I wanted to ask is the difference between the patterns.
Mm-hmm.
How much is driven by correlations within each of these networks? So you've got the 6 networks lined up there,
mm-hmm.
and how much of it is just a pattern across all the different cross-correlational areas? Because I guess what's going into the analysis is just all the cross-correlations between areas across that whole triangle that we can see. But I wonder if you've got a measure of whether what's really happening is establishment of patterns in the 6 networks, or whether it's really just a whole cross-brain, cross-area phenomenon that allows you to differentiate between the four patterns.
So we did not check which inter-network correlations would be more meaningful in terms of differentiating clinical conditions more. We were using the whole connectome really in that case. Now I'm thinking that these regions were selected based on previous work, but we also checked another way, other parcellations, brain parcellations with more regions. But it seems that this way of self-organizing the brain is choosing it across different parcellations and dimensional regions. But no, we did not see at that time which interactions between which networks would make the difference, if this is what you ask.
Yeah, or even if it's driven by networks. I mean, it could be hard to tell just by looking at the figure. I mean, it could be driven by interactions between regions that aren't part of the network, since they're all put into the analysis together.
Yeah, no, we did not check which network drives what. But what we found though, it was when we correlated the functional with the anatomical connectome. Like when we checked what is the similarity between this connectome and the structural connectivity, we found that this functional organization was most closely related to the anatomy. So here, hey, I can see you also. But this pattern one was more deviant from it. So that could be the most straightforward, let's say, drive of how to explain those patterns.
That's very interesting. Thanks.
You're welcome.
So just one final question. Daniel asks, how long does the brain stay in each of these four states on average before shifting to a new state?
So this is what we estimated here. We checked the mean duration in seconds of each pattern. And we found that, for pattern one, the complex one, it was mostly it lasted longer in healthy people than in patients, and the opposite in the minimally conscious state. So see, we can see here, the Chris-Oswald test. That was the Chris-Oswald test that we did. So there is also a meaning of how long we are staying in these conditions, in these states. Not only how fast we know how we transition, but how fast we stay, also how long we stay in these patterns. I can continue. Is there any other question?
Zachary, you still have your hand up. I don't know if that's from before, if you have a new question. Oh, yeah, hand is down. So I think that's it. Thanks, Athena.
I want to continue because I don't want to get to extend the time, but maybe this should be your problem, Nadine. I should not care about the time. The last part of my talk has to do with, apart from brain-based metrics, now we align with this new view that actually our bodies can also be very informative for our states of consciousness. So in that case, we can see that disorders of consciousness really concern this part of when we say selfhood. If we consider the self, and Stephen, you're an expert on the self, of course, and please enter the discussion. But the model of seeing the self as a social narrative and minimal served us well, because we consider people that they cannot communicate. Either you are in a disorder of consciousness, or in anesthesia, or in deep sleep. You still entertain this part of minimal selfhood. And this is the line of my lab at the moment, trying to find physiological proxies of how to evidence this minimal selfhood. So this work was inspired by what we did in Paris during my postdoc, where we used the local global paradigm. You're all familiar with this audible auditory robot. So it's this. So at the end of the sequence, there is this deviant sound. And then we checked how the heart was reacting to these deviants. And we checked the R2R interval, and as well as the time before the deviant sound and afterwards. And so what we found across the different states of consciousness, we found that the cardiac cycle accelerated only in minimally conscious state, which means that somehow this deviant was acting as a surprise to them. So the heart was reacting to that. And interestingly, when we used it as another feature for between class differentiation, here we can see how when ECG was combined with EEG data, the accuracy of predicting one class over the other was much higher, other than having information about the classification coming from EKG only or EEG only. So this means that these cardiac markers, physiological markers, if we combine them with brain-based metrics, can help to have a bigger, more clear picture about the state of consciousness. And now we do something similar here. We try to see different physiological markers. Here, for example, we can see how the nystagmus. Nystagmus is an ocular response. It has very specific waveform that happens after you stimulate the inner ear with water. So one hypothesis we check is that if we perturb in the receptive system, like the vestibular system, which is responsible for the equilibrium of your body, like the balance, whether we can find meaningful adaptations of reflexes in very low levels of consciousness, like when people cannot communicate. And this is ongoing work, and we can talk about that later on. So putting everything together, I go along with the view that consciousness is not just one thing, is not located in one place of the brain, of the body. It's rather multidimensional. So trying to find fingerprints of how this happens in different states, now I think it's our next challenge, which dimension would, and the intensity of each dimension would characterize, let's say, a state of sleep, awake, anesthesia, and so forth. But when it comes to my talk today, it seems that I can contribute a bit to determine a bit somehow these dimensions by saying that we have a good impression that anticorrelations can be one dimensions, that correlations meaning like supported by the neural inhibition as a mechanism, cross-modal interactions potentially reflecting multisensory integration, interstate dynamism that is supported by the metastable ability of the brain, and also embodied responsiveness that it can be best explained by the active inference principle. So this would be my, how do you say, 5 pennies, like my own contribution to this at this moment. And of course, I know that it's not only that, but these kind of proxies metrics seem to be severely constricted in low levels of consciousness. So by way of reasoning, they therefore must be very, very important to support typical wakefulness. And thank you very much for the invitation. It seems that consciousness is a construct that we have to all agree on what it means. We need to define it because it's not only a neuroscientific question, it has pragmatic and ethical and moral consequences, and therefore it concerns us all. I think what we do is very, very important.
This was great. Thank you. So let's all unmute and give Athena a big round of applause.